solving. Now, as Secretary Albright was building a world-class resume, she was also amassing an amazing and provocative collection of jewelry. And in her new book, Read My Pins, Stories from a Diplomat's Jewel Box, Secretary Albright talks about nearly 200 pins and the stories behind them. And this is so much more than just a picture book, though. Read My Pins is part memoir, part history, part politics, and it gives you an intimate look at Secretary Albright's life through the different pins that she wore. As she said once, I found that jewelry had become a part of my personal diplomatic arsenal. Could you talk a little bit about the genesis of your family's connection with jewelry and politics? We're going to show a picture of a ring that had special significance to your family.
Well, that ring we call Tito's ring, and let me explain it. My father was the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia immediately after World War II. And it was a time when things were very bad there after World War II. They had a lot of poverty, hunger, pulling themselves together after a very difficult war. And he had gone to a diplomatic event with Tito, who was the authoritarian / dictatorial ruler of Yugoslavia at the time. And there was a treaty being signed, and there were a number of the wives of the ambassadors were in one room, the ambassadors were in the other. And what happened, as my mother tells the story, partisans in their kind of fatigues came out bearing silver trays, and on them were 3 little velvet boxes, and in each one there was a ring with the birthstone of the wife. And my mother was born in May, so there's an emerald in the middle. And so she got this ring, and my father was quite appalled, frankly, because in all this poverty, where did this ring come from? And he wanted to give it back, but that was not very diplomatic. Anyway, so then the ring was around, Tito's ring, and when I finally got my PhD, my parents gave it to me. And I even now it's in the museum, but I didn't get a lot of chance to wear it. It's a little gaudy.
Now, gaudy has not stopped you with some of the pins. And in your role as UN ambassador, you boldly criticized Saddam Hussein for his refusal to do what Iraq had promised, and that's to give up information about their arsenal of weapons of mass destruction.
Well, I say that this book would not have existed if it hadn't been for Saddam Hussein. Because when I got to the UN, my instructions, I was an instructed ambassador, was to say perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein every day, which he deserved because he'd invaded another country. So that's why there was this poem. So I decided to wear, I had that snake pin before, so I wore it whenever we did Iraq. And so all of a sudden one day, I think you've all seen how the ambassadors come out from the Security Council meeting and meet with the press. And some camera picked up the fact that I had on this snake pin. They said, well, why are you wearing a snake pin? And I said, because Saddam Hussein called me an unparalleled serpent. And then I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I actually bought a lot of pins that I thought would reflect what we were going to do. And that's how it all started, because when I was in a good mood, I wore balloons and flowers and butterflies, and on bad days, I wore various bugs and carnivorous animals. And when people would say, what are we going to do today? It was shortly after the first President Bush had said, read my lips, and so I said, read my pins. And I did send a copy to the first President Bush, and he said, love the title. That's correct. Was that it was my assignment to get condemnation of Cuba for what they had done. And I was given the transcript of what the Cuban pilots were saying to each other as they were chasing our unarmed civilian planes. And they said, it was a little risque, you know, we have cojones, they don't have cojones, we're going to hit their cojones. And when they hit the airplane, they very blood-curdling way said, we hit their cojones. So I then we had to do a press conference, and I said, it's not cojones, it's cowardice. I thought that the UN press corps would faint that I would use such a word. But in honor of the pilots, instead of wearing it with the bird soaring up, which I usually did, I had with the head turned down. I love being a woman, and this started at the UN. I mean, what happened was that I was told I had a role model there. Jean Kirkpatrick had been there before me, and she sat down with me before I went, and because she'd also been a professor, and she said, Madeleine, you've got to get rid of your professor clothes and buy some suits. So I did that, but they were bright colors, and I had fun, and that's where the jewelry stuff started. I did, however, find it irritating, and I found it irritating on behalf of other women that are in the government, have been in the government since, when people comment on their hair or their clothes, which they don't do about men. And when Secretary Rice wore boots somewhere, there were comments about that, and I was on TV, and I said, why don't you comment about what she said and not what she had on? But I do think that you have to have your own style. You have to feel good. I developed, if you covered other secretaries, you know that I am the one that invented the art of diplomatic kissing. And so there.
We didn't have that.
No. What is interesting is I did not wear pants, mainly because I looked awful in them. The one time I did wear pants, which was in Latin America, and I was going to the president of a particular country's ranch on a Sunday, and I wore pants, and the press in Latin America took me apart for that, saying that it didn't show respect. So I think things have changed a little bit also. There were lots of kind of innuendos about the fact that a woman could not be Secretary of State, especially in terms of dealing with the Middle Eastern leaders. And what was interesting was that a lot of the ambassadors up in New York, the Arab ambassadors, got together and said, we didn't have any problem with Ambassador Albright, and our countries wouldn't have any problems with Secretary Albright. Now, I didn't have any problems. I actually arrived. It helped. I came in a very large plane that said United States of America. But what I did was I did not wear a veil when I met with leaders. I did when I went to a mosque. But I basically, by the time that I had been secretary for so long, I think that they followed their own rules. I have to tell you this, I had more problems with the men in our own government than the foreign leaders.